Financing solutions for a plastic-free future. In the previous videos, we saw how plastic pollution is shaped by trade rules, production incentives, and global market systems. Finance sits at the center of these dynamics. In this final video, we focus on a dedicated financial mechanism is essential to making a global response to plastic pollution credible, equitable, and implementable. Today we are joined by Mohammed Kamal, an expert in waste management systems and environmental financial mechanisms. Why does achieving a plastic-free future require targeted financial solutions rather than relying on existing environmental funding channels?
Let's break down the problem to two parts. The first part is the existing legacy plastic pollution. Existing legacy plastic pollution, to tackle it, is fundamentally a waste management issue, and waste management is very expensive. Also, there's different parts of the waste management value chain, the flow of waste, the flow of material, that requires different types of interventions, whether at the policy level or the technology or implementation level of waste collection and disposal. It's fairly expensive and requires targeted types of intervention at the country level or at the regional level. On the other hand, there is dealing with plastic pollution in a way where you're trying to prevent the usage of single-use plastic or the usage of unnecessary plastics in our society. That requires more targeted interventions at the incremental level, where you're trying to add activities to the existing baseline for how governments deal with material and material flow, especially on plastics, that slowly shift you towards a sort of system that does not use plastic, that does not require packaging, or that does not require the usage of single-use or even dual-use material. You go towards a system that is purely based on refill or reuse.
Understanding where money is needed and who bears responsibility is central to this discussion. From your experience, where are the main funding gaps for countries like Egypt in addressing plastic pollution?
When it comes to funding gaps, there's several actually. First of all, let's take a step back and actually view multilateral environmental agreements. Multilateral environmental agreements historically have not received their fair share of financing. Why do they need financing? Because on paper, we agree on a few number of commitments as countries, and realistically, the main enabler to do these actions will be financing, especially for developing countries. So, where will the money come from? Well, usually the money is going to come from developed countries or donor countries that usually have had their fair share of extractivism to reach a certain level of development and flow towards developing countries, those who have not had their fair share of time or usage of resources. And the primary gaps are usually in the core infrastructure and in the core of implementation. What you're usually going to find, and usually the main area of disagreement between countries and during the negotiations, is the concept of incremental cost and enabling functions. You'll find that developing countries, by nature, have a very wide definition of what an enabling function is, while for donor countries, they want to narrow it down. An enabling function is an activity that if you don't commit or you don't do, you will not be able to transition. Meaning, let's give an example. If you need to develop or you need to phase out your usage of single-use plastic bags, you require a strategy at the country level. Now, that is an enabling function. You're not going to start any campaign or any legislative implementation at the country level without a strategy existing in the first place. To develop a strategy requires a very strong level of coordination between governmental and non-governmental actors, including the private sector, which requires a lot of money. Now, if you view a developing country needs and their annual financial budgeting for the Ministry of Environment, for instance, and if we look at the country as a country like Egypt, our priorities might not necessarily have to focus on single-use plastic. It is a problem, but it might not be the most urgent problem, and meaning it will not get its fair share of financial support. We're already burdened in environmental management. And here is where the treaty financing comes in, because it will be able to provide that enabling function financing so that you can develop the strategy, start developing the legislation, and do the implementation on the ground.
Earlier in the series, we explained that a financial mechanism is a structured system for mobilizing, allocating, and managing funds. What kind of financial mechanism are you advocating for in the plastic treaty context?
The type of financial mechanism that we need it's not an easy formula to figure out. Let's take an example. Let's take the example of a bank and your personal account within that bank. Principally, the bank is the financial mechanism in a way where theoretically the bank is just a framework that manages money, right? And your account is where the money is held. It's where money is going to be dispersed, whether your account, a company's account, or several individuals and their accounts. You are most probably going to choose the bank that is most convenient for you, that is easy to use and doesn't require you to spend too much time, and at the same time provides you a level of safety, or provides you a level of comfort knowing that your money is safe. Now, let's go to financial mechanisms and environmental agreements. One of the main challenges we face with financial mechanisms that currently exists is that they're not predictable and they're voluntary. If we look at the United Nations Convention for Combating Desertification as an example, we find that the current setup was voluntary financial contributions, meaning that such a convention that is fundamentally focused on challenges in developing countries has not received its fair share of financing. And that means that this voluntary setup doesn't work. Another point, when we look at the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastic Pollution, is there has been a very big discussion on public and private financing. Now, let's not delve into this. It's something that is already well covered and discussed. One of the core aspects of this is predictability. If we look at as creating a financial mechanism, it needs to be a framework that is predictable. Predictable in essence, meaning that me as a country or me as a region, I'm able to predict within the next time period, could be 5 to 10 years, how much financial flow is coming in. Due to the nature of private sector, that is probably not possible. No matter what levels of mechanisms you create around this, it's only public financing that is predictable, because you can hold countries accountable under the United Nations framework, generally speaking, to commit these funds and to follow through with them. So we need a financial mechanism that is predictable. We need it to be accessible. It needs to be designed in a way where there is actual representation for the countries that receive and also the countries that give the money, and to have it designed in a manner that treats the priorities of the treaty itself. It does not divert, it does not go onto other subjects or serve the interests of a few countries. An example, and in the plastic context, is technology. While technology is important, it is not the systemic change we really need. We need more enabling activities to be on the ground and at a country level rather than importing technology. And it's important that the financial mechanism, when it's created at the start, regardless of how the fund will feed into the mechanism, makes sure that the core focus of the treaty remains the focus of the financial mechanism. Diverting it dilutes the focus of the treaty itself.
Funds alone are often not enough. Beyond financing, what else must the treaty deliver to make this mechanism effective?
Beyond financing, there are several layers of work that is needed to have an implementable treaty, a treaty that is just not another agreement on the shelf. There are several layers to this. The first face of the card is the commitments. What are we committing into this treaty? What is the scope? What are its objectives? The second part of the card is what is our means of implementation? How are we going to implement the scope and its objectives? Now, let's look at the scope. We need a scope that tackles plastic and its full life cycle as a problem and as a material. Now, a lot of people could have opinions on whether you need to tackle plastic as a material or just plastic as waste. Fundamentally though, from the waste sector, we definitely know that if you don't start from the material development phase, you are very likely not going to be able to resolve the problem. Rather, you're shifting the burden towards waste management. On means of implementation, on how we implement a treaty that tackles the full life cycle of plastic as a material, we need means of implementation that take into account the local realities on the ground, that take into account that even within a country like Egypt, the north and the south don't have the same modalities of waste management, don't have the same challenges on the ground, don't even have the same weather. And you have geographical locations that are very dry and those that receive more rain per year. Those require different forms of waste management. In addition to this, and I believe this is the core focus that should be the focus of how we implement this treaty, is systemic change. We need incremental but systemic change in how we supply materials, supply our daily provisions. The primary driver of plastic pollution in a country like Egypt is our daily consumables, those that are unnecessarily packaged in plastic or provided in plastic, whether plastic bags or plastic packaging, purely for the sake of convenience and to speed up the process of supplying the material from point A to point B. We now have the capability, the technology to change this systematically. However, the reason it's not changing systematically is fundamentally because of financing. And this takes us back to the need for financing. Now, is it the fact that a country like Egypt, if it gets incentivized with $500 million, things will change? No, it will not. It requires a long-term plan. However, enablers, financing very specific interventions at critical points is what's going to fasten things. Think of it this way. We have a plastic pollution crisis. If there is no treaty and we leave business as usual could take us 100 years to 150 years to start resolving the problem and to transition. However, with a treaty and targeted financing, that period could be reduced to 50 years. And that 50-year gap is what is a make or break for the safety of our own planet, the areas that we live in as people.
Some might see financial mechanisms as overly technical or complicated. Why is this issue so central to your work?
Financial mechanisms are critical to my work and everyone's work. If we work in the environmental sector, we are fundamentally a development-oriented sector. Development is catalyzed by financing. There is no development without adequate financing. And unfortunately, for a big part of recent modern history, you find that development financing is very much focused on aid, or the concept of providing financial aid. Not enough development is happening through national or regional South-South collaborations, etc. Well, it has increased, but not to the scale needed yet. So financing is crucial because at the end of the day, ambition on paper doesn't mean much if you can't really implement it on the ground. You need the financing enabler that turns the sentence in the treaty into a plan, and that plan into more targeted actions at the regional level. And then at the regional level, it gets broken down at the national level. And it starts to slowly incentivize countries to adopt action. As non-governmental actors and as private sector actors, we're usually recipients of capacity building, recipients of support, or taking part in consultations or meetings that are hosted by governments or even financing institutions. And what is important is having an inclusive framework. And that inclusive framework, to create it, requires financing. If financing is not there, ambition alone is not going to be enough. You're going to reach a point where the ask is going to be, oh, who's going to finance this? Do we have enough money at the national level to finance it? The majority of financial mechanisms, just for your information, are co-financed. The funding that a country like Egypt receives from a financial mechanism is usually met with financing from Egypt as a government side, putting money as well. So the $50 million that Egypt could receive for a major strategy development to tackle plastic pollution, they would have to put in its face as well probably another 50 million. Now, different financial mechanisms have different funding ratios, but that means there is always national commitment to some capacity. However, most developing country governments are overwhelmed. There is a lot that needs to be done and not enough resources. And that meaning that the work on getting funds and getting financing to the right targeted areas is ever more important than before because of the increasing complexity of environmental issues and the fact that we're losing the race. The race is running quickly, it's very fast, and we're a bit behind. And the only way to start catching up is through financing.
What message do you have for new students entering the field?
My message for trying to figure out what area you want to focus on environmental policy or even multilateral agreements, etc., would first, I think you have to look at two things. One is you need to figure out what you genuinely care about. That small spark makes a very big difference to the level of curiosity you're going to have. And two is, what does the planet need? What does Egypt need? What does my house need? You could start something very small or go very big and then bring these two together and start to explore more. There is no industry or sector that has that mix as much as the environmental sector. We have challenges growing every day, and the challenges are growing at a scale that is hard to comprehend. So there's so much to work on. It's hard to comprehend because of the digitization of society as we know it. And this digitization and this technology sort of development and adoption that is happening at a very quick rate comes at the expense of our environment. So it's going to be very important that we environmentally manage this sustainably, or else we run out of resources and the future doesn't get to experience the quality of life we lived. So we do have a responsibility. And whether you choose to take that path or not, someone has to. And there's a lot of work to be done. So if there's a lot of work to be done on this level of, I guess, diversity of work that can happen in the environmental sector, then I strongly encourage you explore environmental policy and the level of change that it can cause at the societal level.
A plastic-free future depends not only on ambition, but on systems that can deliver. Financial mechanisms are not side issues. They are the backbone of implementation. Understanding them is essential to understanding whether global commitments will succeed.